1967, a Green Beret medic watched a village elder die of a snakebite because his medical kit was locked and the key was at headquarters 80 miles away. And I have spent the last 50 years wondering if the lock was the problem, or if it was just the fact that I was the one holding the damn thing. It was a stupid, heavy piece of metal, that key, resting on a brass ring that felt like it weighed 100 pounds, though it probably weighed nothing at all. I wasn't a career man back then. I was a kid from a town in Ohio where the biggest crisis was a busted radiator or whether the high school team would make the state playoffs. I remember the smell of the shop floor where my old man worked, that thick, permanent scent of hot iron and grease, and how I used to think that was the only smell the world really had. Everything before 1967 felt like it was filmed in soft, golden light, the kind you only notice when it's gone. I played varsity ball. I had a girl named Sarah who smelled like vanilla extract in summer rain, and I had this vague, stupid idea that the world was a place that rewarded people for being decent. I thought if you followed the rules would hold you up. I didn't know yet that rules were just lines drawn in the sand by people who weren't standing where we were standing. I enlisted because I wanted to be useful. That sounds like a lie now, looking back at the wreckage of my own life, but it was the truth then. My older brother had done his time, and there was this unspoken pressure that felt like gravity, pushing you toward the uniform. I didn't want to be a hero. I just wanted to be part of something that mattered, something bigger than the stagnant air of that Ohio town. When I got to the training center, I thought I was ready for the physical part, the running and the push-ups, the screaming drill sergeants who seemed to think we were all personal insults to their ancestors. But I wasn't ready for the camaraderie. I wasn't ready for the way those men I'd never met, would eventually become more real to me than my own skin. We were a collection of boys from farmhouses and city apartments, all trained to act like we weren't terrified. We laughed at the absurdity of it all. We made jokes about the food, the beds, the stupidity of the brass. Dark humor became our language. If you weren't laughing, you were crying, and in that environment, crying was a luxury nobody could afford. The transition from civilian to soldier happened in stages, but the real shift was the day we touched down. The air in Southeast Asia didn't smell like iron or grease. It smelled like rot, like damp earth, like diesel fumes and something else, something sweet and sickly that I didn't understand until I saw my first casualty. The heat was a living thing. It draped itself over your shoulders the moment you stepped off that C-130, and it never really left. I was a medic, which meant my job was to be the one who stayed calm when the sky fell. They taught us how to stop bleeding, how to set bones, how to breathe life into lungs that wanted to quit. They didn't teach us what to do when there was no hope, or when the resources weren't there, or when the distance between a life and a death was 80 miles of jungle and a steel lock you couldn't pick. My team, we were a tight unit. There was Miller, a guy from Georgia who could recite every line of a baseball game he'd seen in 1964, and Henderson, who carried a photo of his newborn daughter everywhere, even though he knew the humidity was turning the edges of the picture into mush. We spent the quiet hours talking about the things we'd do when we got back. Not big things, not trips to Europe or fortunes to be made. Miller wanted to buy a fishing boat and sit on a lake for 10 years without hearing a single command. Henderson just wanted to change a diaper. We shared these dreams like they were holy relics, keeping them tucked away in our pockets. The terror was always there, of course, humming in the background like a faulty generator. Every patrol, every footstep on a trail, every rustle of leaves was a test of your nerves. You never really let your guard down, but you got used to the weight of it. You learned to sleep with one eye open and your hand near your weapon. You learned that the silence in the jungle was never actually silent. It was just waiting for you to make a mistake. The missions were a blur of mud and sweat. We'd walk for hours, our boots caked in red clay, our bodies straining under the weight of our gear. The tension was constant, a tightening of the gut that didn't loosen even when we stopped for the night. We were looking for things we couldn't see, fighting an enemy that knew the terrain better than we knew our own mothers' faces. There was a weird kind of pride in it, though. We were the guys who got the job done. We were the ones who didn't crack, but even then, there were moments of grace. A package from home with a dry chocolate bar, a sunset that burned across the sky in colors I'd never seen in Ohio, the quiet shared look between two men who had just survived an ambush. We held onto those moments like they were lifeboats in a rising tide. I remember the village elder. He was a man who seemed ancient, his face a map of wrinkles that told a history I couldn't comprehend. He wasn't involved in the fighting, or so we thought. He was just a man trying to keep his people alive in the middle of a furnace. When he got bitten by that snake, he didn't scream. He just looked at me with eyes that were already saying goodbye. I was the medic. I had the medicine in the kit. But the gear had been standardized, locked, and the protocol was rigid. I remember the weight of that key in my hand, the coldness of it against my sweating palm. I radioed for permission for the code for anything, and the voice on the other end was static and indifference. 80 miles. It might as well have been the moon. I sat there in the dirt, the man's breathing slowing down, his pulse fading beneath my fingers, and I felt a whole tear open inside me. I wasn't just a medic anymore. I was a spectator to a death I could have prevented, bound by a system that valued policy over breath. That moment changed everything. It didn't happen all at once, but the structure of my world, the one I'd brought from Ohio, started to buckle. I stopped thinking about the mission and started thinking about the man. I stopped believing that the rules were designed to save us. I started seeing the war not as a series of tactical movements, but as a long, slow grinding of human souls, and I just knew, that I wouldn't be the same person on the other side of it if I even made it to the other side. The rest of that deployment turned into a series of jagged edges. We kept moving, we kept fighting, but the joy we'd found in the small things felt thinner, like a coat that didn't fit anymore. I looked at Miller and Henderson, and I didn't see the guys who wanted to fish or the guys who wanted to be fathers. I saw ghosts. I saw men who were already marked by the things we'd seen and the things we'd been forced to ignore. We didn't talk about the village elder. We didn't talk about the lock. We talked about the next objective, the next patrol, the next day. We were operating on a kind of autopilot that kept us alive while the parts of us that were actually human went quiet. The worry that lived in the back of my mind wasn't about dying anymore. It was about what I would be when I came home. I thought about Sarah and the way she used to laugh at my jokes, and I wondered if she'd recognize the man who would walk through her front door. I wondered if I'd ever be able to smell the air in Ohio without expecting it to turn into the smell of burning diesel and rot. I felt a guilt that was heavy and dark, a companion that never slept. I'd survived, and he hadn't. I'd held the key, and the earth had swallowed him up. Then came the day we got the order. It wasn't different from a dozen other orders, except for the way the air felt that morning. The humidity was oppressive, pressing down on our chests, and the jungle seemed to be closing in around us. The sergeant in charge, a man who usually moved with a methodical, almost bored efficiency, was checking his watch every 30 seconds. He called us into a tight circle, his face a mask of focus. He laid out a map on the ground, the paper damp and curling at the edges, and pointed to a sector we hadn't touched yet. It was a deep, shadowed valley, a place that didn't appear on the standard intelligence reports. He told us that there was a target, a high-value objective that had to be neutralized before dawn. He didn't say it like a soldier. He said it like a man who was already counting the casualties. I looked at the others. Miller's face was set, his jaw clenched so hard I thought his teeth might crack. Henderson looked down at his boots, the ones he kept polished even in the mud, as if that small ritual could keep the chaos at bay. We were a team, but in that moment we were islands of isolation, each of us calculating our own odds of making it through the night. I checked my gear for the 10th time. The kit was still locked. The key was still in my pocket, a piece of metal that felt like a curse. I looked up at the canopy of trees where the light was struggling to reach the floor, and I felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature. The sergeant leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper that cut through the sound of the insects. He said the name of the objective, a name that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I looked at the map, then back at him, and I knew. I knew that whatever happened in that valley, it would be the thing that finished the job. It would be the thing that made sure I never actually left. He looked at me, just for a second, and in his eyes, I saw the exact same thing I was feeling. The realization that this wasn't about the war anymore. It was about us. We were walking into a place where the rules didn't exist, where the past didn't matter, and where the future was only as long as the next heartbeat. My hand went to my chest, touching the key, and I felt the cold, hard weight of it against my ribs. The sun was beginning to dip, turning the sky a bruised, angry purple. The sergeant took a breath, his lungs expanding in the thick, wet air, and he opened his mouth to give the final word. The sergeant didn't give a speech. He just looked at us, his eyes flickering over each of our faces like he was trying to memorize us, and then he closed his fist and turned toward the tree line. We moved in a single file, the kind of silence that's not really silent at all, but a thick, pressurized hum of nerves and sweat. Every step was a negotiation with the earth. We walked through waist-high ferns that felt like razor blades, our boots sinking into mud that sucked at our ankles as if it wanted us to stay. The air tasted like stagnant water and ancient mold, the kind of smell that coats the back of your throat and stays there no matter how much water you drink. I was the medic, so I was mid-pack, watching the back of Henderson's neck. He had a small mole right near his hairline, and I found myself staring at it, focusing on that tiny, insignificant detail. because it was the only thing in that whole green hell that looked like it belonged to a person who had a life back in Georgia. We weren't talking. We hadn't talked for 3 miles. The only sound was the rhythmic thud of our gear and the occasional snap of a branch that sounded in the dark, like a gunshot going off next to your ear. My hands were shaking, just a little, a fine tremor that started at my wrists and moved up my forearms. I kept thinking about the key in my pocket, the one that wouldn't open a damn thing that mattered, and I kept thinking about the look on the village elder's face when he realized that I was just as trapped as he was. I wanted to tell Henderson something, maybe just to stop worrying about that photograph, but the words felt too light, too thin to be dropped into the middle of that darkness. We reached the ridgeline right as the moon decided to hide behind a bank of heavy, low-hanging clouds. It was so dark you could reach out and feel the blackness against your skin. The sergeant signaled a halt, and we went down, hitting the dirt with a thud that felt way too loud. I pressed my face into the leaf litter, feeling the grit of it against my cheek. My heart was a frantic bird inside my chest, hitting my ribs, wanting to get out. We waited 10 minutes, 20, an hour. My legs were cramping, the muscles knotting up, but I didn't dare move. I watched a line of ants crawl over the barrel of my rifle, a tiny, indifferent civilization going about its business while we were there, holding our breath and waiting to die. I looked over at Miller. He had his eyes closed, his lips moving just a little, like he was reciting a prayer or maybe just counting the seconds until he could get back to that fishing boat. I felt a surge of love for him that was so sharp it almost doubled me over. It wasn't the kind of love you feel for a friend back home. It was the love of a man who knows he is looking at someone who is also waiting to be erased. If Miller died, the world would lose the way he stood, the way he hummed those songs under his breath, the way he could tell a story about a baseball game and make you feel like the sun was shining on your face. That was the horror of it, not the dying but the vanishing. The idea that all of that, the history, the humor, the specific way he tilted his head when he listened, could be wiped out by a piece of lead in a fraction of a second. Then the sound started. It wasn't an explosion. It wasn't a scream. It was a mechanical, grinding noise like a heavy gate being dragged across concrete. It came from down in the valley, right where the sergeant had pointed. We froze. The sergeant signaled again, a sharp, downward cut of his hand, and we began to crawl forward. The mud was cooler now, and it felt slick against my belly. My pack felt like it was filled with lead, each strap digging into my shoulders like a knife. We saw them then, the lights. Not flares, not muzzle flashes, but something steady and pale, glowing near a cluster of structures that looked like they'd been built 1,000 years ago. They were moving, shadows cutting across the beams of light. The sergeant tapped my shoulder and pointed toward a small rise, signaling me to move up. I moved, my breath coming in short, jagged gulps. I didn't think about the risk. I didn't think about the logic of it. I just moved. We were maybe 40 yards out when the world opened up. It wasn't a fight, it was a harvest. The sound of the weapons wasn't like anything I'd heard before, a rapid, rhythmic tearing of the air. I saw Henderson go down. He didn't even make a sound. He just folded like a marionette whose strings had been cut by a master hand. I scrambled toward him, my bag sliding off my back, the heavy, useless key clinking against the side of my canteen. Miller was shouting something, but his voice was swallowed by the roar. I grabbed Henderson's shoulder and rolled him over. His eyes were wide open, looking at something I couldn't see. The blood was dark, almost black in the dim light, soaking into the red clay until the ground became a thick, hungry paste. I ripped open his shirt, my fingers fumbling with the buttons, my mind screaming for the protocol, for the steps, for anything to make the red stop. But the wound was too big. It was a crater, a ruin of meat and bone that defied all the training they'd given me in that sterile classroom in Georgia. I pressed my hands against it, feeling the warmth of his life draining away into the earth, and I started to pray. I don't know who I was praying to. I don't think I was praying to anyone. I was just begging the air to be different, begging the night to stop being so efficient at its work. Miller was next to me then, firing his rifle with a steady, robotic rhythm, his face blank, his eyes fixed on the shadows ahead. He looked like he was at the ballpark, his swing perfect, his focus absolute. I looked back at Henderson, and his face was starting to go pale, the skin losing that flush of life. He reached up, his hand fumbling in his pocket, and he pulled out that photograph of his daughter. It was soaked with his own blood, the paper turning to mush between his trembling fingers. He held it out to me. He didn't say anything, but his eyes were so clear, so terribly full of the future he was never going to see. I took the picture. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped it. I looked at him and I saw it all. I saw the house he was going to buy. I saw the diaper he wanted to change. I saw the 10 years of silence Miller wanted on that lake. I saw the girl named Sarah and the smell of vanilla and the golden, soft light of Ohio. It was all there, gathered together in that one bleeding, dying man. And then he just stopped. The tension left his body, that rigid line of his jaw finally relaxing into something that looked almost peaceful. I sat there with him. The world was still screaming around me, the flashes, the noise, the chaos, but I was in a bubble of complete, deafening silence. I looked at the key in my pocket. I reached down, pulled it out, and stared at the jagged bit of metal. I felt a laugh rising in my throat, a hysterical, jagged thing that had nowhere to go. I laughed, a short, barking sound that didn't sound like me, and then I stopped, the guilt hitting me like a physical blow. Why was I here? Why was I holding this piece of iron while he was holding a photograph? Miller slumped back against the rise, his rifle running dry. He looked at me, then at Henderson, then at the photo in my hand. He didn't cry, he didn't yell. He just took his helmet off and wiped his face with a sleeve that was caked in grime and blood. He looked so tired, older than any man should ever be allowed to look. He leaned over and touched Henderson's shoulder, a gesture that was so gentle it made me want to howl. It was the kind of touch a mother gives a child, and seeing it there in the middle of that slaughter felt like a betrayal of everything. The firing had died down. The attackers were gone, melted back into the trees like they were never there to begin with. We were left in the hollow, the smell of cordite mixing with the sweet, sickening scent of the wet earth. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed down on our lungs. I crawled over to Miller and sat beside him. We didn't look at each other. We watched the sky, waiting for the first gray hint of morning that would make the nightmare official. I opened my medical kit. The lock was still closed. I took the key, the one that felt like it weighed 100 pounds, and I threw it. I didn't watch where it landed. I just felt the weight leave my pocket, and for a second I felt nothing at all. No relief, no anger, just a terrifying hollow space where my conviction used to be. Miller leaned his head back against the dirt. He started talking about a hot dog he'd had at a doubleheader in Atlanta. He described the mustard, the snap of the casing, the way the stadium lights looked against the night sky. He talked for 20 minutes, his voice low and steady, a man telling a story to keep the monsters at bay. I listened. I listened because if I didn't listen to him, the only other sound was the wind moving through the trees, a sound that started to feel like the voices of all the men who weren't coming back. My hands were still stained with Henderson's blood. I rubbed them against my trousers, trying to get it off, but it just smeared, turning into a deeper, darker brown. I looked at the photo of the little girl again. Her eyes were bright, oblivious to the fact that she was currently being held by a man who was watching his own soul fray at the edges. I tucked the photo into my breast pocket, right over my heart. The sergeant crawled over, his uniform shredded, his face a mask of dried mud. He didn't ask how we were. He didn't need to. He looked at Henderson, looked at us, and then he just nodded. That was it. A nod, as if we were discussing the weather, as if we were deciding where to eat lunch. I stared at him, my vision blurring, waiting for him to break, to scream, to do something that acknowledged the fact that the world had just ended. But he didn't. He checked his watch and told us we had to move before the light came up. We had to move, that was the command. We had to pack our gear, shoulder our rifles, and walk back through the hell we just crawled out of. I stood up, my legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. I looked down at Henderson one last time. He looked so small, just a bundle of fabric and history left behind in the mud. I wanted to stay. I wanted to dig a hole and bury him and sit there until the war stopped. But the sergeant was already walking. I picked up my pack. The straps bit into my shoulders, and the weight of it was suddenly unbearable, not because of the gear, but because of the empty space where the key used to be. We started to walk. Miller was in front of me, his gait uneven, his head bowed. The jungle was waking up, the birds starting to screech, the insects resuming their rhythmic, indifferent buzzing. I looked at the trees. They were just trees. They weren't hiding enemies. They weren't watching us. They were just wood and leaves, growing in the dark, fed by the rain and the rot. I felt a surge of cold, hard clarity that was more painful than the fear. I realized then that none of it mattered. The missions, the objectives, the lines on the map, they were just stories we told ourselves to make the killing feel like something else. We were just boys acting out a script written by people who didn't know our names and didn't care if we ever made it back to a lake in Georgia or a shop floor in Ohio. We walked for 3 hours. No one spoke. The sun started to bleed over the horizon, turning the sky a pale, sickly yellow. I kept expecting to hear them behind us, the ghosts of the night, the ones who had taken Henderson. But there was only the sound of our own breathing, the ragged, desperate sound of men who were trying to figure out how to keep moving when their bodies wanted to quit. We reached the extraction point, a small, trampled patch of grass that looked like a scar on the side of the hill. A helicopter was waiting, its rotors turning, a slow, hypnotic beat that vibrated in the soles of my boots. We loaded up. I sat on the floor of the cargo bay, my knees pulled to my chest, my hands shaking. Miller sat across from me, his eyes fixed on the floor. The pilot didn't look at us. The crew chief stood by the ramp, his face covered by a visor, his hands resting on the mounted gun. The bird lifted off, the ground falling away, the jungle expanding into a green, endless sea. I looked down, searching for the spot, searching for the place where we'd been, but it was already gone, swallowed by the canopy in the distance. I felt a sob rise in my throat, a deep primal thing that I'd been holding back since the village elder died. I bit my lip until I tasted blood. I couldn't let it out, not here, not in front of them. I looked at the crew chief. He was just looking out the open door, watching the clouds, his posture relaxed, his feet planted firmly on the metal deck. He didn't know. He didn't know about the key or the elder or Henderson's daughter, or the way the mud felt when you realize you're the only one left to carry the weight. To him, this was just a job, a flight, a routine extraction. And that, more than anything, was the horror. The fact that the world kept moving, the rotors kept spinning, the planes kept flying, even though a piece of me, the part that believed in rules, the part that believed in the goodness of things, had been left behind in that valley. I closed my eyes. I felt the vibration of the craft, the rhythmic thrum of the engines, the cool air blowing in from the open bay. I was still here. That was the most terrifying part. I had survived, and the guilt of it was a living, breathing thing that curled up in my gut like a snake. I reached into my pocket and touched the photograph. It was still wet, the paper pulpy and fragile, but I could still see her face. I could still see the life she was living, a life that was happening right now, in a world that felt like it belonged to a different species. I didn't know if I would ever be able to tell her. I didn't know if I would ever be able to tell anyone. The stories I'd tell back home would be lies, thin, pathetic shadows of the truth. I'd talk about the heat, maybe the boredom, maybe the food. I'd leave out the lock. I'd leave out the look in Henderson's eyes. I'd leave out the way I had to wash the blood off my hands in a stream while the rest of the world kept turning. The helicopter banked, turning toward the base, and I saw the runway appear in the distance, a long, gray line cutting through the green. It looked so orderly, so clean, so perfectly, brutally American. I thought about the shop floor in Ohio, the smell of the iron, the way my father's hands looked after a shift, strong, sure, capable of fixing anything. I realized then that I could never go back to that room. I could never go back to the boy who thought a lock was a way to keep things safe. I opened my eyes and looked at Miller. He was staring at me. He didn't say anything, but he reached across the space between us and put his hand on my knee. His fingers were calloused, his skin gray with dirt, but the touch was heavy, solid. It was the only thing in the world that felt real. We didn't talk. We just sat there, two broken things held together by the gravity of what we'd seen, listening to the roar of the rotors as they carried us away from the only place where we knew who we were. The base came into view, a sprawl of buildings and fences and trucks, a place that felt like a set piece, a hollow stage. I knew what would happen when we landed. We'd be processed, we'd be checked, we'd be given a meal, a bunk, and a clean uniform. We'd be expected to stand tall, to answer the questions, to file the reports. We'd be expected to be the men we were before we entered that valley. I felt a cold rage start to burn in my chest, not at the enemy, not at the war, at the idea of having to act. At the idea of having to sit at a table and eat a meal and pretend that I wasn't still sitting in that mud, holding a dying man's hands. I wanted to scream, to tear my uniform to shreds, to run into the jungle and never come out, but I stayed still. I kept my knees to my chest. I kept my face blank. The helicopter touched down, the landing gear bouncing on the tarmac. The ramp began to lower, letting in the blinding, indifferent light of the afternoon sun. I saw the ground crew moving, their vests bright orange, their movements practiced and precise. They were waving us in as if we were just another shipment of supplies, just another set of parts to be inspected. I stood up. My legs were trembling, but I managed to balance. I looked at Miller. He stood too, his movements stiff, his face set in that same mask-like expression. We walked toward the ramp, the wind from the rotors whipping at our clothes. I stepped out, my boots hitting the hard, flat surface of the runway, and I felt nothing. No relief, no hope. Just the crushing, absolute weight of everything I was now required to carry alone. I looked at the horizon. The sky was clear, wide, and blue, a color that didn't belong here, a color that looked like it belonged to a dream. I could see the barracks, the mess hall, the wire fence surrounding the perimeter. It was all so simple, so neatly organized, and it was all so completely, utterly wrong. I walked past the ground crew, their voices drifting over to me, joking, complaining, talking about a letter from home, about a game on the radio. They were alive in a way I knew I wouldn't be again. I reached the edge of the tarmac and stopped. I stood there, watching the other men file out of the helicopter, their heads down, their gear heavy. I felt the photo in my pocket, the mushy, blood-soaked paper pressing against my ribs. I knew what I had to do. I had to report. I had to go to the office, talk to the officer, explain the losses. I had to lie or tell a truth so partial it would be a lie anyway. I had to be the medic. I took a breath. The air here was different, less rot, more fuel, more distance. It was the smell of a machine that never stopped, a machine that thrived on the parts we fed it. I turned and started to walk toward the command post, my shadow long and thin against the concrete. I walked, and I knew that even when I stopped, I would never really be still again. I would never be able to sit in a room, in a house, or on a porch without feeling the phantom weight of that key, without hearing the sound of the jungle, without feeling the cold, wet reality of the mud. I arrived at the headquarters. The building was cool, the air conditioning a shock against the heat. I stepped into the hallway, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, that white, sterile sound that strips the color out of everything. A secretary looked up, her face pleasant, her smile ready. She saw my uniform, the stains, the dirt, the way I was looking at the world, and her smile faltered, just for a second. She reached for a clipboard. She was going to ask. She was going to ask how it was. She was going to ask if we were okay. I didn't let her. I looked past her into the open office where the officers sat behind their desks, their maps spread out, their pens poised. I looked at the walls, at the posters about safety and protocol and the mission, and I felt the last of that old, decent world inside me evaporate. I walked right past the desk. I didn't stop. I walked down the hall, the sound of my boots echoing on the linoleum, a harsh, lonely rhythm that announced I was back, but that the man who had left wasn't the one who had returned. I found a quiet corner near the latrine. I sat on the floor, leaning my back against the wall, and I pulled the photograph out. I held it in my hand, staring at the little girl, at her smile, at the way she looked into the camera without a thought for what was happening half a world away. I started to cry then, not loud, not shaking. Just the tears falling hot and fast, hitting the picture, smearing the ink. I cried for Henderson. I cried for Miller. I cried for the village elder and his stupid, locked medicine kit. I cried for the kid from Ohio who thought the rules were there to hold him up. I cried until the air in my lungs was empty, until there was nothing left to give. And then I sat there in the quiet, smelling the bleach and the sweat and the old, familiar dust. I was still here. That was the truth I had to live with. I was the one who walked out. I was the one who kept the photo. I was the one who had to figure out what to do with the fact that I was alive when I didn't deserve to be. The door opened. Someone walked in. I quickly wiped my face, tucked the photo away, and stood up. I didn't look at them. I walked past them and back out into the light. The day was ending, the sun dipping below the barracks, the sky turning that same bruised purple I'd seen in the valley. I watched the light fade, and I felt the darkness coming, the kind that doesn't just block out the sun, but settles into the marrow of your bones and stays there, waiting for the next moment, the next patrol, the next time you have to decide who you are in a world that doesn't care if you're standing or falling. I turned toward the barracks. I walked, each step deliberate, each step a test of my own gravity. I could see the lights coming on in the windows, the soft, amber glow of a place that was supposed to be home, a place that was supposed to be safe. I knew it wouldn't be. I knew that even in the middle of bed, even in the middle of conversation, even in the middle of the quiet, I would be back there in the mud with Henderson, listening to the silence of the trees. I walked until I reached my door. I put my hand on the knob. I took a breath. I opened it. The transition back was not a moment, but a slow, grinding friction that never quite stopped. They put us on a plane at 3:00 a.m., the cabin smelling of stale sweat and jet fuel, the air inside so cold it made your teeth ache. I sat next to a kid from Alabama who spent the entire 12-hour flight staring at his own boots, his hands locked between his knees, his jaw tight enough to snap. We didn't talk. Nobody talked. The plane was a pressurized tube of people who were all in their own way, still somewhere else. Every time the landing gear shuddered or the engine pitch shifted, 20 men would twitch at once, eyes wide, breath caught in the throat, waiting for the floor to drop out from under us. I spent the time holding that photograph in my breast pocket, feeling the corners of it fray against my chest. I wondered if the little girl in the picture would even know the man she was waiting for if he stepped off the tarmac today. I wondered if he would know himself. When the wheels hit the runway in California, the silence in the cabin was so thick you could have sliced it. There was no cheering, no clapping, just a collective, ragged exhale that didn't sound like relief. It sounded like giving up. We marched off the plane and into a terminal that looked like a movie set. The lights were too bright, the air was filtered and sterile, and the sound of civilians talking, about baggage claims, about rental cars, about the price of coffee, felt like a foreign language I had forgotten how to speak. I walked through the sliding glass doors and into the arrivals area, and there she was, my wife. She looked exactly like the memory I had been keeping, but the reality of her was a shock to the system. She was wearing a blue sweater I remembered, her hair pulled back the way she always wore it when she was cooking, and for a second I felt a surge of something so pure and sharp it was like a knife to the gut. Then she saw me. She ran, her heels clicking against the linoleum, her face breaking into that smile that used to be my entire world. She slammed into me, wrapping her arms around my neck, sobbing my name into my shoulder. I stood there like a statue. My arms hung at my sides, my muscles locked, my brain screaming at me that this wasn't real, that the transition was a trap, that at any second the floor would explode and the smell of jasmine and perfume would be replaced by the copper tang of blood. I held her, but I didn't feel her. I felt like I was draped in heavy iron, a ghost haunting my own homecoming. She pulled back her hands on my face, looking at me with those eyes that were searching for the man who left, and I felt the guilt hit me again. This cold, hollow weight that told me I was a fraud, that I had brought a stranger back in my skin. The drive home was worse. The highways were too wide, the cars too fast, the world too full of people who were living in a reality that had no connection to the one I was still navigating. We pulled into the driveway of the house we'd bought 2 years before I shipped out. It looked smaller than I remembered. The grass was long, the paint on the porch was peeling, and the sight of the front door, with the same brass knocker I used to polish on Saturdays, made my chest tighten until I could barely breathe. I walked inside. Everything was the same. The smell of lemon polish, the stack of mail on the counter, the faint scent of the coffee she'd made that morning. It was a museum of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else, someone who hadn't stood in the red clay of a valley watching a friend bleed out while the moon hid behind the clouds. That night, I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. She was asleep, her breathing slow and rhythmic, the sound of it the most peaceful thing I had ever heard. I couldn't move. I couldn't lie down. I sat there until the sun started to bleed through the blinds, painting stripes of gray across the carpet. I thought about Henderson. I thought about the way the sergeant had looked at us, that final, silent nod. I thought about the key I had thrown away and the photograph I had kept. I touched the picture in my pocket, the paper soft and fragile now, and I tried to remember the sound of Henderson's voice, but it was being erased by the sound of a distant, humming refrigerator. That was the terror of it. The way the world back here was so hungry to swallow you, to make you forget, to bleach the edges of the memory until there was nothing left but a thin, gray smudge. The first few months were just a long, quiet drowning. I got a job at the plant, back in the iron, where the heat was loud and the work was simple. It was the only place I could go where nobody asked questions. We'd stand around the welding stations, the sparks flying, the smell of ozone and burnt metal filling the air, and we wouldn't say a word. I liked the noise. It drowned out the thoughts. But then I'd go home and I'd sit at the dinner table, and she'd ask me how my day was, and the silence that followed would be so heavy it felt like it was crushing the house. I tried to talk. I tried to tell her about the jungle, about the ridge, about the night the world ended, but the words would stick in my throat, dry and hard. If I said the words, they became real. If I kept them inside, I was the only one who had to live with them. There was a Tuesday in November, cold and crisp, when a car backfired 3 blocks over. I was in the kitchen, making coffee, and before my brain could even tell me it was just a car, my body had already put me on the floor under the table, my hand reaching for a weapon I didn't have. I stayed there for 20 minutes, my heart hammering against the floorboards, sweat soaking through my shirt. When she walked in, she didn't scream. She didn't call for help. She just knelt on the floor next to me, took my hand, and sat there until I could stand up. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't offer a platitude. She just stayed with me in the dark, and that was the moment I realized that she knew. She didn't know the story, she didn't know the valley, but she knew the hole I had brought home with me. We tried the VA. I went to a room with beige walls and a flickering light, and I sat across from a man who had a degree and a pen and a look of practiced pity that made me want to burn the building down. He asked me how I felt. He asked me if I had dreams. He asked me if I felt guilty. I looked at the coffee stain on his desk, a jagged, dark ring, and I realized he was just another person trying to put a lock on a door that had already been ripped off its hinges. I stopped going after the 3rd time. I didn't need a cure. I needed to know that I was still standing, even if I was leaning, and that was something no one in a beige room could give me. I started walking. Late at night, when the house was quiet and the dreams wouldn't let me sleep, I'd get up and walk through the neighborhood. I'd walk past the houses, the quiet, sleeping streets, the porches with their American flags standing stiff in the night air. I'd walk until my legs ached, until the physical pain of the miles was more real than the phantom pain in my chest. I saw a lot of things in those hours. I saw people who were lost in their own ways, people who were also carrying things they didn't have names for. I stopped looking at the houses as structures and started looking at them as containers, every one of them filled with secrets, every one of them holding a version of a person who was trying to pretend they were still the one who walked out the front door years ago. I kept the photograph. I never showed it to anyone. It's sitting in a box in the back of my closet, tucked under a pile of old socks and forgotten gear. Sometimes when the house is empty and the sun is at that specific low angle that reminds me of the ridge, I take it out. I look at her face. I look at the way she's smiling at someone who isn't there anymore. It doesn't make me sad, not in the way it used to. It makes me feel steady. It reminds me that Henderson existed, that he was real, that he loved something so much he kept a piece of it in his pocket while the world fell apart. That's enough for me now. It's not much, but it's real. I'm still here. I go to work, I come home, I eat dinner, I sleep. I still check the exits when I walk into a store. I still wake up when the wind bangs a shutter against the house. I still have that moment, once or twice a week, when I laugh at something and then stop, the sound dying in my throat because I remember the hollow feeling of the valley, but I'm still here. I've learned how to manage the weight. It's like carrying a heavy pack you can never take off. After a while, your muscles just adapt to the strain. You stop looking for the straps to loosen and you start focusing on the road under your boots. I have a garden now. It's small, just a few rows of tomatoes and peppers in the backyard. I like the way the dirt feels, cool, damp, smelling of life and rot at the same time. I spend hours back there pulling weeds, turning the soil, watching the plants reach for the sun. It's not the jungle, it's not the valley. It's a small, manageable piece of the world that I can keep safe. I stand there, the sun warm on my neck, and I think about the sergeant. I wonder if he's still standing somewhere, watching the tree line. I wonder if Miller ever got that fishing boat. I don't know. The distance is too wide, the years are too thick, but I hope they are. I hope they found a place where the ground isn't made of red clay and the trees aren't full of ghosts. There's a peace in knowing that the war didn't win. It took a lot. It took the best parts of us. It took the innocence and the belief and the easy, golden light of the life we thought we were owed. But it didn't take everything. I'm sitting in my living room. The house is quiet. The air smells like the cedar wood of the fire I just built. I can hear my wife humming in the kitchen, a low, melodic sound that is the most beautiful thing I have ever heard. I don't feel the need to tell her the whole truth. She lives in this world, and I live in the one I brought back, and we exist in the space between them, anchored by the love that somehow survived the impossible. I don't look for answers anymore. There aren't any. The things we did, the things we saw, the things we had to carry, they don't need a summary. They don't need a moral. They just need to be held quietly by the people who were there. I'm the only one left who knows about the key, and I don't need to find it. I don't need to open the lock. I just need to be here in this room, with the warmth of the fire on my face and the knowledge that, against all odds, the day is coming to an end. I walk to the window. The neighborhood is dark. A neighbor's dog barks once, a lonely, sharp sound in the distance, and then silence returns, heavy and comfortable. I look at my reflection in the glass. The man looking back is older, his eyes a little harder, his face etched with the lines of everything that has passed. He's not the boy who went to boot camp in Georgia. He's not the medic who held Henderson's hands in the mud. He's someone else, someone who has learned how to live with the ghost of the person he used to be. And that's okay. That has to be okay. I turn back to the room. The fire is settling, the logs glowing with a soft, steady heat. I walk over to the chair and sit down, feeling the weight of my bones, feeling the slow, sure pulse of my own life. I am tired, but it is a good, heavy fatigue. It's the kind of tired that tells you you've done the work, you've survived the day, and you've earned the right to just sit here and breathe. I don't think about the ridge. I don't think about the helicopter. I think about the way the tomatoes are coming along in the garden and how the frost is going to hit them soon. I close my eyes. I can hear the house settling, the floorboards creaking, the wind moving through the trees outside. It's not the sound of a jungle. It's not the sound of a war. It's the sound of a home. I take a deep breath, the air clean and cold, and I let it out slowly. I don't have to explain it to anyone. I don't have to justify it. I don't have to be anything other than a man sitting in his own living room, waiting for the night to pass. Everything you think you know about the silence changes the moment you finally stop trying to break it.